September 17, 1944 dawned cold and gray over the English Channel as Major Robert Henry Kane checked his equipment one final time. The 35-year-old officer from the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, had volunteered for something most considered a suicide mission, Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's audacious plan to end the war by Christmas. Among his kit lay a weapon that War Office bureaucrats had dismissed as little more than a drain pipe with delusions of grandeur, the projector, infantry, anti-tank, or PIAT. The PIAT's origins trace back to the desperate days of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a career officer and inventor, had watched French tanks burn under German Panzerfaust fire and understood that British infantry needed something revolutionary. His design was crude by conventional standards, a spring-loaded spigot mortar that fired a hollow charge bomb. The weapon weighed 32 pounds, kicked like an angry mule, and required the operator to expose himself dangerously close to enemy armor, typically within 100 yards. Military brass initially rejected it outright. "It looks like something a plumber cobbled together in his shed," one senior officer reportedly sneered during trials at Lulworth Ranges in Dorset. Yet desperation breeds innovation. By 1943, with German Tiger and Panther tanks dominating European battlefields, the War Office reluctantly approved PIAT production. The weapon's hollow charge warhead could penetrate nearly 4 inches of armor, theoretically enough to crack open a Tiger tank's side plating. Theoretically, in practice, the PIAT was temperamental, difficult to reload under fire, and possessed accuracy that one training manual delicately described as highly dependent on operator skill and favorable conditions. Major Kane had no illusions about the PIAT's limitations. During training exercises in Lincolnshire earlier that summer, he'd watched soldiers struggle with the brutal cocking mechanism, which required pushing the barrel down against the spring with your entire body weight. Men had broken thumbs and suffered black eyes when the weapon misfired. The PIAT earned nicknames among troops: Plumber's Nightmare, the Pig, and less printable variations. Standard infantry doctrine suggested using it from prepared positions, with supporting fire not exactly feasible in airborne operations deep behind enemy lines. But Kane possessed something that transcended weaponry specifications: an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Born in Shanghai to British merchant parents, he'd spent his childhood navigating the rough neighborhoods of the international settlement, learning early that survival often meant standing your ground when retreat seemed sensible. That philosophy would serve him well in the hell awaiting at Arnhem. As his Su-47 transport aircraft rumbled toward Holland, Kane ran his hands over the PIAT's cold steel. Around him, paratroopers from the 1st British Airborne Division joked nervously, checked parachutes, and tried not to think about what intelligence had reported: 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting near Arnhem. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. Tigers, Panthers, and veteran Waffen-SS troops who'd survived the Eastern Front's crucible. They were flying toward a single bridge over the lower Rhine that Montgomery believed would unlock Germany's industrial heartland, Arnhem Bridge. The plan called for the British airborne forces to capture and hold it for 48 hours until armored relief arrived from the south. 48 hours. Kane looked again at his PIAT and wondered if the damned thing would even last 48 minutes. September 18, 1944 brought chaos to the Dutch countryside. The drop zones near Arnhem had scattered British airborne forces across miles of unfamiliar terrain, and Lieutenant Colonel John Dutton Frost's 2nd Battalion found themselves in a desperate race toward the bridge. Major Kane's company landed nearly 2 miles off target, crashing through Dutch farmland as German machine gun fire raked the fields. Within hours, the carefully orchestrated plan began unraveling like cheap twine under tension. Frost's force, roughly 700 men, reached the northern approach to Arnhem Bridge by nightfall on the 17th. They'd seized several brick buildings overlooking the span, establishing defensive positions in what locals called the bridge houses, but the rest of the 1st Airborne Division never arrived. German SS troops, reacting with shocking speed, had blocked every approach route. Frost's men were alone, surrounded, and facing an enemy that doctrine insisted wouldn't be there. Major Kane's unit fought through 3 miles of hell trying to reach Frost. According to battlefield reports preserved in the Airborne Forces Museum archives, Kane's company encountered their first Tiger tank on the Utrecht-Zug road at approximately 1400 hours on September 18th. The beast emerged from an orchard like some prehistoric predator, 54 tons of Krupp steel armor, mounting an 88mm gun that could crack a Churchill tank from over a mile away. Kane's men scattered into roadside ditches as the Tiger's main gun boomed. The high explosive round vaporized a garden wall where 3 paratroopers had taken cover seconds before. The weapon everyone had mocked suddenly represented their only hope. Kane grabbed the PIAT from his sergeant, a veteran named John Thompson who'd carried the weapon since their drop. "Give me that bloody drainpipe," Kane reportedly said, his voice carrying the rough humor that soldiers use when death breathes close. The Tiger commander hadn't spotted them yet, his vision limited by the tank's narrow viewing ports. Kane knew the mathematics. He needed to be within 100 yards, preferably closer. He needed a side or rear shot. The Tiger's frontal armor was impenetrable to PIAT rounds, and he needed extraordinary luck. The hollow charge bomb's shaped explosive would theoretically focus its blast into a jet of superheated metal capable of penetrating armor, but theoretically meant little when a Tiger's machine guns swept the landscape. Kane crawled through a drainage ditch, mud soaking through his battledress, the PIAT's 32 pounds feeling like 300. 70 yards? 60? The Tiger pivoted, its turret traversing toward where his men lay concealed. 50 yards. The training instructors at Lulworth would have called this suicidal. Kane called it necessary. He rolled into a kneeling position, brought the PIA to his shoulder, and aimed at the Tiger's side plating behind the road wheels where armor was thinnest, where engine components sat vulnerable. The weapon's crude sight wavered. His hands trembled not from fear but from the physical exertion of carrying the weapon while crawling. Deep breath. Squeeze the trigger. The PIAT roared. The bomb arced across the afternoon sky, trailing smoke, then impact. The hollow charge detonated against the Tiger's hull with a crack that echoed off surrounding buildings. For one frozen second, nothing happened. Then thick black smoke began pouring from the Tiger's engine deck. The massive tank shuddered, stopped, and its crew bailed out through hatches, uniforms smoking. Sergeant Thompson reached Kane's position, staring at the burning Tiger in disbelief. "Bloody hell, sir. You actually killed a Tiger with the pig." Other soldiers who'd witnessed the shot began spreading the word through their scattered positions. The PIAT, the weapon they'd cursed and mocked, had just validated Stuart Blacker's despised design in the most dramatic way possible. But one Tiger down meant little in the grand scheme. Intelligence reports that reached Frost's position that evening confirmed their worst fears. At least 30 German tanks were converging on Arnhem Bridge, including multiple Tigers and Panthers from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. 700 British paratroopers holding a bridge against 2 Panzer divisions. September 19th, 1944 transformed Arnhem Bridge into what survivors would later call the Cauldron. German forces, recovering from their initial shock, had surrounded Frost's position with methodical precision. Sturmbannführer Victor Grabner, commanding the 9th SS Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, received orders that morning to recapture the bridge at all costs. Grabner was a veteran of Normandy and the Eastern Front, a professional soldier who understood urban warfare's brutal calculus. Major Kane's company, still cut off from Frost's main position, had fortified several brick houses along Benedendorpsweg Street, roughly 400 yards from the bridge approaches. The building's thick 19th-century construction offered some protection, but German mortar had already collapsed 2 structures, burying 5 paratroopers under rubble. Ammunition was running critically low. Medical supplies had dwindled to field dressings and morphine syrettes. And the Tigers kept coming. The second Tiger appeared at dawn, accompanied by half-tracks carrying SS Panzer Grenadiers. This engagement, documented in Cornelius Ryan's comprehensive account, "A Bridge Too Far," demonstrated both the PIAT's potential and its agonizing limitations. Kane positioned himself in a second-story window overlooking the street, the PIAT resting on a shattered windowsill. The Tiger advanced slowly, its commander cautious after yesterday's loss, infantry screening its vulnerable sides. Kane waited. Patience in combat is a rare virtue, requiring nerves that don't fray when death approaches at walking speed. The Tiger's commander apparently decided the houses were clear. He ordered his infantry forward while the tank provided covering fire. Fatal mistake. At 40 yards criminally close by anti-tank warfare standards, Kane fired. The PIAT bomb struck the Tiger's turret ring, the weakest point where the rotating turret met the hull. The explosion was different this time. Instead of smoke, there was fire-intense, white-hot fire that suggested the bomb had penetrated into the crew compartment or ammunition storage. The Tiger's hatches flew open. Only 2 crew members escaped, their uniforms ablaze before secondary explosions ripped through the vehicle's interior. The accompanying panzer grenadiers, witnessing their armored support disintegrate, retreated in disorder. But killing Tigers exacted a terrible price. The PIAT's firing signature, a distinctive whoosh and explosion, marked the shooter's position like a lighthouse beacon. German mortar began systematically demolishing the house where Kane had fired. He and his loader, Private James Bennett, had approximately 30 seconds to evacuate before high-explosive rounds transformed their position into rubble. They barely made it to the cellar before the building's upper floor collapsed. Contemporary accounts from the Imperial War Museum's oral history collection described the next 72 hours as a continuous nightmare of close-quarters combat. German forces, frustrated by stubborn British resistance, began employing flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear buildings methodically. The SS troops were skilled, experienced, and increasingly angry. At one point, according to witness statements, German officers under a white flag demanded Frost's surrender, promising honorable treatment as prisoners of war. Frost's response was unprintable but clear. Major Kane, now commanding elements from 3 different companies whose officers had been killed or wounded, moved constantly between defensive positions. He'd acquired a second PIAT after its original operator, Lieutenant Jack Grayburn, took a fatal sniper round while defending the bridge approaches. Grayburn, who would posthumously receive the Victoria Cross for his actions at Arnhem, had destroyed 1 Tiger and damaged another before his death. Kane inherited his weapon and remaining ammunition, 12 bombs total. The 3rd Tiger came on September 20th at approximately 1100 hours. This one proved more cunning, using destroyed vehicles and rubble as cover, advancing in short rushes while infantry suppressed British positions with sustained machine gun fire. Kane watched from a basement window, calculating angles and distances. The Tiger stopped behind a wrecked half-track, only its turret visible, imperfect shot. Low probability of penetration, but ammunition couldn't be hoarded for perfect moments that might never arrive. He fired at the turret's face, hoping to at least damage the gun optics or breach the barrel. The bomb struck the mantlet, the armored shield protecting the gun mounting. No penetration, but the impact apparently injured the gunner or damaged internal mechanisms because the Tiger withdrew, trailing hydraulic fluid. Not a kill, but a mission kill. The tank was combat ineffective. In desperate urban fighting, those were equivalent. By nightfall on September 20th, Frost's perimeter had contracted to roughly 300 yards around the bridge's northern end. Casualties exceeded 50%. Ammunition was so scarce that soldiers scavenged German weapons and ammunition from the dead. September 21, 1944 arrived with a German artillery barrage that transformed dawn into apocalypse. For 90 minutes, shells screamed into the British defensive perimeter with such intensity that the ground itself seemed to ripple and shake. SO Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, commanding the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, had decided that subtlety was counterproductive. If the British paratroopers wouldn't surrender, he would bury them in their positions. Major Kane emerged from a collapsed cellar at 0630 hours, his battledress white with brick dust, blood crusting a shrapnel wound across his left forearm that he'd wrapped with a torn undershirt. The artillery had transformed the neighborhood into moonscape buildings that had stood since Napoleon's time, reduced to jagged walls and smoking foundations. Somehow, impossibly, men still fought from these ruins. Sergeant Thompson found Kane in what remained of a bakery, sharing a cigarette with a wounded corporal who'd lost his left foot but insisted on manning a machine gun position. "Sir, we've got multiple contacts," Thompson reported, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "At least 4 tanks moving up Alexanderstraat, infantry and battalion. Strength behind them. And sir, ... he paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're down to 7 PIAT bombs total, 7 rounds, 4 tanks minimum, probably more." And the mathematics of annihilation were elegantly simple. Kane checked his watch, a birthday gift from his wife, who believed he'd be home by Christmas. That seemed a dark joke now. "Right then," he said with the peculiar British understatement that soldiers employ when situations become utterly desperate. "Let's make each shot count, shall we?" The 4th and 5th Tigers appeared together, a tactical evolution that demonstrated German adaptation to the PIAT threat. By operating in pairs, they could provide mutual support and suppress anti-tank positions while the other advanced. It was sound doctrine employed by a competent enemy who'd learned expensive lessons. The Tigers emerged from smoke and morning mist like primordial monsters, their commanders having learned to keep infantry tight to their flanks, denying British soldiers the close-range shots that had proved so devastating. Kane and Thompson established an ambush position in the ruins of what had been a 3-story apartment building. The structure's front had collapsed entirely, creating a rubble slope that offered both cover and a clear field of fire down the street. They positioned the PIAT between 2 massive foundation stones, creating a stable firing platform. The technical manual recommended prone firing for stability, but urban warfare rendered textbook tactics quaint suggestions rather than viable procedures. The lead Tiger advanced to within 60 yards before Kane fired. The PIAT bomb struck low, impacting the tank's drive sprocket, the large wheel that drove the track. The explosion didn't penetrate the armor, but it severed the track and damaged the sprocket mechanism. The Tiger lurched to a halt, immobilized, its crew frantically trying to reverse on one track. Meanwhile, the 2nd Tiger identified Kane's firing position and pivoted its turret with mechanical precision. "Move, now!" Kane grabbed Thompson's webbing and physically dragged him backward as the Tiger's 88mm gun fired. The high explosive shell struck exactly where they'd been positioned 3 seconds earlier. The overpressure wave slammed both men against a brick wall hard enough to crack ribs. Kane tasted copper blood in his mouth, his ears ringing so badly he couldn't hear Thompson screaming something urgent. But muscle memory functioned when consciousness wavered. Kane reloaded the PIAT with movements drilled by hundreds of training repetitions. His hands found the new bomb, seated it on the spigot, locked the mechanism. The 2nd Tiger was repositioning, seeking a better angle. Immobile, the 1st Tiger remained dangerous. Its guns still functioned, its crew still fought. He had 2 bombs, 2 tanks. The ugly calculus demanded perfect execution. According to the battle damage assessment compiled by British Army historians after the war, Major Kane's next shot achieved what textbooks would later describe as optimal terminal effects. The PIAT bomb struck the immobilized Tiger's turret rear, where armor was thinnest to allow turret rotation. The hollow charge penetrated, and whatever it hit inside ammunition, fuel, crew transformed the tank into a blast furnace. Flames erupted from every hatch and vision port. The 2nd Tiger's commander, watching his comrade's vehicle burn, made a tactical decision that saved his crew but doomed German tactical objectives. He reversed rapidly, withdrawing to a safer distance. Tank commanders who'd witnessed PIAT kills at close range developed healthy respect for the weapon, regardless of what staff officers in Berlin might have thought about its crude design. But Kane's triumph lasted perhaps 10 seconds before a German machine gun position spotted him silhouetted against flames. Rounds stitched across the rubble, one striking his left thigh with the sledgehammer impact of a full-power rifle cartridge. He collapsed, the PIAT clattering away, consciousness threatening to flee entirely. September 22nd. 1944 found Major Robert Kane in a medieval torture that modern warfare had perfected. The bullet wound in his thigh had become infected inevitable given the filth, lack of medical supplies, and the impossibility of maintaining sterile conditions while fighting from rubble and sewage. The battalion's medical officer, Captain James Logan, had exhausted his morphine supplies 2 days prior. Pain management now consisted of whiskey rations and raw willpower. Yet Kane refused evacuation to the aid station, an increasingly theoretical concept given that aid station now meant a cellar packed with 60 wounded men, no anesthesia, and dwindling hope. "I can still shoot," he told Captain Logan, who'd seen enough combat casualties to recognize when argument was futile. The truth was simpler and darker. Walking wounded who could fight remained more useful than evacuees who couldn't. The brutal mathematics of siege warfare reduced men to functions, shooters, stretcher-bearers, ammunition carriers, corpses. German pressure intensified throughout the morning. Panzerfaust-armed tank hunters worked systematically through the rubble, clearing buildings with demolition charges and flamethrowers. The SS troops, initially contemptuous of British resistance, had developed grudging respect for opponents who simply would not break. But respect didn't translate to mercy. This was the European theater in 1944, where SS divisions brought Eastern Front brutality to Western Europe's polite countryside. The 6th Tiger appeared at 1300 hours, this one supporting a company-strength assault by Panzer Grenadiers from the 9th SS Panzer Division. Intelligence estimates later suggested the Germans committed approximately 300 infantry to this attack, backed by armor, artillery, and growing certainty that British relief forces would never arrive. Lieutenant Colonel Frost had been gravely wounded, command devolving to Major Freddie Goff, who faced the impossible task of defending positions that barely existed against an enemy with overwhelming material advantage. Major Kane, positioned in what remained of a warehouse foundation, watched the Tiger advance with the detached analysis that extreme pain and exhaustion sometimes produce. The tank moved carefully, methodically, its commander having learned expensive lessons about British anti-tank capabilities. Infantry spread wide, providing mutual support, suppressing suspected firing positions with machine gun bursts. This was competent, professional tactics executed by experienced troops. But competence has limits when ammunition runs low and casualties mount. Kane held one of the last 3 PIAT bombs in the British perimeter. The other 2 were with Lieutenant Jack Cramer on the opposite side of the shrinking defensive position. 3 bombs. 1 Tiger definitely, probably more German armor in reserve. A rational calculation suggested conserving ammunition for critical moments. But what moment was more critical than German infantry preparing to overrun your position? Private Bennett, still serving as Kane's loader despite a broken collarbone from earlier shelling, had scrounged an additional PIAT from a destroyed position. They now possessed 2 launchers, one serving as a backup if the primary weapon failed, which the temperamental PIAT frequently did. Bennett positioned both weapons, checked the crude sights, and looked to Kane for orders. The private was 19 years old, a Devonshire farmer's son who'd volunteered for airborne forces because it paid an extra 2 shillings per day. 2 shillings didn't seem adequate compensation for this particular hell. 50 yards, Kane said, his voice strained. Let him close to 50 yards. Aim for the engine deck, if possible side shot if necessary. 1 shot, make it count. The words came out choppy, interrupted by waves of pain from his infected leg. His vision occasionally blurred, shock and infection producing dissociative effects that combat veterans recognized as the body's desperate attempt to protect itself from overwhelming trauma. The Tiger closed. 70 yards, 60. The German infantry held back, allowing their armored support to identify and suppress anti-tank positions. 55 yards. The tank's main gun tracked across the rubble, seeking targets. 50 yards. Kane fired. The PIAT's recoil drove through his shoulder, his body too weakened to properly absorb the weapon's brutal kick. The bomb arced across 50 yards of hell, struck the Tiger's engine deck at an oblique angle, and detonated. The shaped charge penetrated through the thinner rear armor into the engine compartment. Fire followed immediately, not the dramatic explosion of ammunition cooking off, but the hungry, intense burn of ignited fuel and lubricants. The Tiger stopped, smoke poured from its engine deck. The crew, professionals who'd survived combat from Kursk to Normandy, understood when their vehicle had become a death trap. Hatches flew open. Men emerged, some with clothing smoldering, and sprinted for cover. German infantry, witnessing their armored support burning, wavered in their advance. Hesitation, perhaps 10 seconds, while junior leaders decided whether to press forward without tank support allowed. British machine gunners to exact a terrible price. Concentrated fire raked the exposed German infantry. The assault stalled, then broke, survivors retreating to covered positions while dragging wounded comrades. But killing the 6th Tiger had consequences. The PIAT's firing signature again marked Kane's position. German mortar began walking rounds toward the warehouse foundation with mathematical precision. September 23, 1944 dawned with a silence more terrible than the preceding 4 days of combat. The artillery had stopped. The small arms fire had diminished to sporadic exchanges. German forces had pulled back approximately 200 yards, establishing a cordon around the shattered British perimeter. Survivors understood what silence meant. The Germans were preparing something catastrophic. Major Robert Kane counted the living. His company had numbered 123 men when they dropped into Holland. 47 remained capable of fighting, though capable was generously defined. Most were wounded to some degree. All were exhausted beyond anything training had prepared them for. Sleep deprivation, malnutrition, dehydration, and the sustained terror of close-quarters combat had reduced even the hardiest paratroopers to automatons functioning on training and will alone. Ammunition inventory made grim reading. Perhaps 200 rifle rounds total, 1 Bren gun with 3 magazines, 17 hand grenades, and 1 PIAT with a single bomb remaining. The weapon that everyone had mocked before the battle now represented their most powerful remaining asset. A single hollow charge bomb versus whatever the Germans were planning. Word came through the skeletal communication. Network runners sprinting between positions because radios had been destroyed or their batteries exhausted, that German negotiators were again offering surrender terms. The message reached Kane via a blood-spattered corporal named Davies who'd been a Cardiff schoolteacher before the war transformed him into a soldier. "Major Goff's compliments, sir, and he says we're not surrendering. Germans say they'll level what's left if we don't quit." Major Goff's response was colorful. Kane managed something approximating a smile despite cracked lips and a fever that made his skin burn. "Sounds like the Major, right then? We'll see what they bring." What they brought was the 7th Tiger, supported by self-propelled artillery and at least 300 fresh infantry from the 10th SS Panzer Division. German commanders had decided that subtle tactics were counterproductive. They would simply overwhelm the remaining British positions with mass and firepower that no amount of courage could withstand. The Tiger that advanced at 1400 hours was commanded by S-Hauptsturmführer Hans-Georg Henk, a veteran tank commander with 12 confirmed kills on the Eastern Front. Henk had studied the previous Tiger losses. He understood that British anti-tank weapons had limited range and required clear firing lines. His solution was methodical devastation. He positioned his Tiger in a hold-down position behind rubble, exposing only the turret while directing supporting fire from infantry and artillery. His plan was to systematically destroy every remaining British strongpoint before advancing to crush final resistance. The first artillery rounds struck at 14:15 hours. For 20 minutes, German guns pounded the British perimeter with precision that suggested careful reconnaissance and fire direction. Buildings that had somehow survived 4 days of combat collapsed under the renewed bombardment. A direct hit on the cellar serving as aid station killed 23 wounded paratroopers instantly, including Captain Logan and most of his medical staff. Through smoke and dust, the Tiger began its advance. Henk's tactics were textbook perfect: bound forward 30 yards, halt behind cover, suppress suspected positions, advance again. Infantry followed in rushes, fire and movement executed with the precision of veteran troops. This was how battles were supposed to be fought. Combined arms tactics, overwhelming force, professional execution. Major Kane, positioned in a foundation crater that offered minimal cover, watched the Tiger approach with the clarity that sometimes accompanies acceptance of death. His infected leg had swollen grotesquely, the wound weeping pus through makeshift bandages. Fever had pushed his temperature to dangerous levels. He'd lost perhaps 30 pounds in 4 days. By any rational assessment, he should have been unconscious. Private Bennett had disappeared, killed, captured, or simply lost in the chaos. Kane was alone with the PIAT, 1 bomb, and a Tiger tank that would reach his position within minutes. The mathematics were elegantly simple. One shot, miss, and the Tiger would crush what remained of British resistance. Hit, and, well, hitting might buy another hour, perhaps two. Relief forces weren't coming. Everyone knew that now. The Tiger closed to 80 yards. Hank's tactics were working perfectly. His infantry had suppressed the few remaining British machine gun positions. His artillery had destroyed prepared defensive works, and his tank presented only a frontal aspect.